News drives markets, and every day, Montel's experienced reporters are on top of the stories that shape European market developments. Can you afford to miss out? Go to montelnews.com for the latest price-driving stories and a free trial.
Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. In this week's pod, we return to the world of PPAs to discuss the growth of green energy and the ways in which companies can get on board the renewables train on course for net zero. How can more firms lower their carbon footprint and contribute to the decarbonisation, not just of the continent, but of the globe? Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, to discuss this is Andrea Grotzke of BayWa. She has a lengthy CV in this field, and the company is a large and important player in the renewable sector, not just in Europe, but also globally. So a warm welcome to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be in your podcast today.
Excellent. How's life in where you are in Germany at the moment?
Well, at the moment, life is beautiful because summer has come up at last. So it's 30 degrees already. It's sunny, and the weekend is just ahead of us. So a good day to go.
Excellent. But if we can start off by talking a little bit about yourself, Andrea. You have quite a long experience in the renewable sector. How has it changed for you in the last sort of 10, 20 years?
Yeah, it has changed tremendously, I would say. I mean, when I started in 2003 to work in the renewable energy space, I kind of advised developers and financial institutions how they shall finance renewable energy projects. So that was quite an interesting start, because then you had to talk about ring fencing projects, you had to talk about cash flow security and all that. And then the sector became more and more sophisticated, and eventually we also started to talk about, we just don't produce just energy, but we also have to sell energy. And that actually brought me, I think it was 8 years ago, it brought me to the PPA topic, where BayWa did quite a lot of projects in the UK, where we had to sell the power to utilities or to corporates. And that's where my first connection to the PPA topic was. And since then, I mean, yeah, it's interesting that more and more corporates, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, they came on the table and they were interested in buying renewable energy. And now, I mean, we can see the huge wave which is coming, and which really is interesting from a developer's perspective, but also, of course, with respect to the energy transition, which we definitely need in order to prevent climate change.
Absolutely. What would you say were the main reasons for this sort of change, or this kind of increased interest from corporates in the renewable space?
Well, first of all, I mean, from a technology perspective, I can clearly say, and that particular applies to solar, that the LCOE, so the capex for constructing a solar plant, really decreased significantly. So in the end, now you can say renewable energy from PV is really affordable. And in many countries, we are even cheaper than conventional energy. So that's, of course, an interesting business case, which the corporates have now. And then on the other hand, as I said, there is the pressure from society on global brands, so that they have to really think about targets in order to reduce their carbon footprint. And that comes together very nicely.
So you've seen the sort of progress of a world of subsidies to, the possibility of very much subsidy-free kind of space now. What have been your highlights in this journey, Andrea?
Yeah, well, actually, we indeed had a couple of highlights, and that goes across the globe, I would say. I mean, we are active in Asia, in particular in Australia. We are also active in the Americas. We signed a couple of nice deals in the US. The last one was with Hershey Chocolate 2 months ago on a 15 years basis. And we had a PPA signed with various parties in the US. And then moving to Europe, we had recently signed a PPA in Poland. That's the first subsidy-free solar PPA, 64 megawatt peak plant, which shall be connected hopefully in the next 1 to 2 months. And that is with Heidelberg Cement. So that was our recent deal. We had quite a nice, and this is interesting from a European perspective. We have signed a virtual PPA with AB InBev last year, which allowed AB InBev to transfer certificates across the border to other countries. So it was a project in Spain, and the settlement on the electricity price happens in Spain, but the certificates are transferred in the countries where AB InBev need to cancel them.
Okay, these are certificates of origin, guarantees of origin.
Exactly.
Okay. So obviously, BayWa is a leading global player in the renewables space. But what for you are the most interesting markets going forward? I mean, you've highlighted some key deals, and I think the Polish solar one is certainly important. What for you and personally and the company are the interesting markets?
Yeah, that's a good one. And it's obviously, I mean, there are markets which are, I think everybody knows that it's interesting to look into the corporate PPA space. But maybe just before we go into the markets in more detail, what we should distinguish is still the technology. So, I mean, we do develop solar and wind projects, and there's quite a significant difference still with respect to corporate PPA potential. So for wind projects, we still rely in quite a number of markets on tariff and tender systems. So that's still quite helpful for the wind side to have them in place. We are more flexible in solar. And obviously we do, especially, for instance, in Poland. I mean, in Poland, there is a tender system, but we explicitly decided to go the corporate PPA route because we believe that this is more attractive for us. It's more flexible for us. And I mean, Poland will stay a very interesting market. And we are working, we are expanding our pipeline and we're working on new deals, which will hopefully come through soon. Our core market is still Spain, where we have a huge pipeline and where we are working on deals, also on quite interesting deals, also with respect to baseload appetite from our clients, where we then structure a baseload product for them based on a solar curve. So that is quite interesting. So these are at the moment our core markets. Germany is interesting because there is a lot of appetite from C&I clients, from industrial clients. However, project development in Germany it's challenging because of long permitting procedures, etc. So it's a little bit lacking behind. So I think these three, I guess it's the most important ones for us, although there are some, let me say, hidden champions like Denmark, for instance, because if you look at LCEs or production costs for solar, and this frontier, the LCE frontier, I call it, is moving up north. So we really can afford developing solar PV also in Denmark and selling the power to corporates.
This is the levelized cost of
Yes. Yeah.
energy. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm a little bit interested here then, Andrea, in the tenders versus PPAs. How do they interact and what makes one company go for tender and the other one for PPA? So in a country like Poland, is it all about, I mean, can't all just be about costs because surely then the tender would be cheaper?
Yeah, that's a good question, Richard. My interpretation is that it has a lot to do with experience to go the route to market and also how you can connect to corporate buyers. And the way we have established our teams within BayWa, we have a dedicated sales team who sells energy solutions, and that's not only offsite or corporate PPAs, it's also on-site solutions. So we have a portfolio of solutions which we can offer corporate. So we are very flexible in approaching them and trying to understand what they need. And that also connects us in a different way than just a pure developer who has obviously also a very extensive knowledge on developing and realizing projects, but selling the power is a capability which also needs to be developed. And from my perspective, this is probably the main difference between the market players.
But in terms of decarbonizing industry, Andrea, what are the challenges here? Because obviously some industries, you can decarbonize much quicker and much more effectively than others.
That's an interesting question, Richard. I think it's definitely various aspects. I mean, overall, if you talk about decarbonizing, that you should also talk about heat, right? At the moment, we just talk about renewable energy because that's what the majority of the companies are focusing on at the moment. But now we come more and more also to the discussion around, that also is connected to the hydrogen debate, which is quite active at the moment, because we see that, and if you look at the numbers, that heat has a very, very significant impact on the overall carbon footprint. According to the International Energy Agency, heat accounts for approximately 50% of the global final energy consumption and contributes 40% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. And about 50% of that total heat produced was used for industrial processes. So you really see that this has such a significant impact on the overall carbon footprint that eventually we also really have to think about how do we reduce those emissions. And this is something which has just been tackled now because the renewable energy discussion is still very heavily ongoing. And coming back to that, it really depends on how a company is steered and how the targets are set, and then how they are implemented. And this is what we see, that the challenge is for companies to overcome internal obstacles in order to bring all stakeholders on the table to make sure that the target can really put into implementation. Because if you look into the contracts they have to sign, that's long-term contracts, as 10, 15 years contracts, whereas they were used to procure energy on a 1, 2, or 3 years basis. And now they really have to connect on a much longer term, which is, well, the risk assessment for these type of contracts. It's quite challenging for the companies. So this is a very important aspect which I see. And then what is also quite interesting, that's the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions debate. At the moment, well, the majority of the companies, I would say, they cover the scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's the emissions they produce themselves or they produce via procuring the power. But the supply chain, for instance, is covered in scope 3. And this would then be the next steps for many companies who have kind of, well, met the scope 1 and 2 targets. And if you look in the apparel industry, approximately 90%, very roughly, of the emissions lie in the supply chain. And if you then if you stay in the apparel industry, if you see that the supply chain sits in Asia mainly, then you have to think about how do you tackle those scope 3 emissions from Asian companies. And this is quite a huge step, which we also have to take in order to meet the overall targets.
So that's if I'm a clothing retailer, for example, in Europe, if I want to decarbonize, as you say, I have to look at, the sites in Asia as well as the way it's transported, et cetera, throughout the whole supply chain.
Exactly. And it has to be pushed down to the local companies who sit in Bangladesh, who sit in Vietnam, in Indonesia. And this is quite challenging because, and then you also talk about solvency of those companies and how can you overcome, or how can you enable investments by those companies. It's quite interesting, and there's brands start to look into that and push also very hard on that end.
You mentioned hydrogen, Andrea. I just want to touch upon that. I mean, we could probably spend several podcasts talking about it, but now it's become, should we say, quite a hot topic. A lot of focus suddenly on green hydrogen. Got strategies and plans, and people, putting forward proposals and projects left, right, and centre. But how realistic is this? And is it really the magic bullet that it's supposed to be? I mean, I'm thinking in terms of the uses of hydrogen in either transportation or heat. I mean, does it make sense? Or is electrification the answer?
Oh, no, I guess it makes sense. I mean, I believe that hydrogen will be a very important puzzle in that challenge. This is what I believe. And so we have to make it happen. And especially in industrial processes. And of course, I mean, the technology has to get cheaper, and then we have to think about transport costs, or not transport costs, but the way of transporting hydrogen. And then, of course, at the beginning of the chain lies, of course, the tremendous amount of renewable energy which we need. And this is something which is getting to be very interesting. And then we will see countries where eventually we will use for producing renewable energy. But as the bits and pieces are not really clear yet, and I fully agree what you said, that it's quite, I mean, there's so many activities and initiatives and all that, which really have to, I mean, they have to sort it, or the industry has to play a key role here also to give guidance. I think it needs pilot projects to understand how this really works and how the stakeholders can play together. And then I think it will come step by step. So we will see in 10 years' time, we will have quite an interesting volume of produced green hydrogen. That's what I believe.
Yeah. No, I think, it'd be interesting to see if we sort of meet up again in 10 years' time, Andrea, and see what actually was realized and what wasn't. But If we return to the subject of PPA, so what is the significance of a PPA? And I want to talk a little bit more about financing here and getting more maybe smaller and medium-sized companies on board. So what's the significance of a PPA in order to get a project financed?
Well, it's still significant element because it's the cash flow securing element. And that's in the end the bottom line, right? That it comes back to how the contracts are structured, whether it's one company or whether it's several companies. Also, several companies. If you structure the portfolio accordingly, then it might also be interesting from a risk perspective. So in the end, it's really coming down to specific clauses in the contract to make sure that the cash flow is secured from a financing perspective. But we also see, I mean, if I compare to the discussions we had with financing institutions 8 years ago in the UK where we started, and now the discussions with investors or also with banks, I mean, a lot has changed. So the community has learned. We all have learned to evaluate the risks, and now it's even more like, when I look on from the project perspective and from an investor's perspective, that it's more like managing the chance of rising electricity prices and at the same time giving a certain cash flow security. So I think that's quite interesting how this has developed, so that the risk appetite also has to be met. So that means that you not necessarily need to contract 100% of the generation with a PPA. You could leave some merchant exposure in the project, so also to take away the market chances.
Another aspect that I'd like to touch upon, because you mentioned, the prospect of rising prices, but there's also the contrary is true in some areas where you have, massive rollout of either wind or solar, which has the combined effect of driving prices down, the so-called cannibalization effect. How do you deal with that? How much of a problem is that?
Yes, it is. It can be an issue. And we see that in particular in Spain. If I look into numbers, or if I look into forecasts, for instance, Pexapark does those kind of forecasts, you can clearly see that there is a significant impact of PV employment in Spain. So if I compare, for instance, the value of PV as a captured price, if I compare that with a baseload price, then in 2024, for instance, the captured price is 94% of the baseload price, whereas in 31, it's predicted. However, it's just a prediction, or it's just a forecast. It's only 70%. So it's a significant decrease of the PV value in Spain. If I look into other countries, it's not as significant. For instance, Italy and Germany, this negative impact is, it doesn't change much between 2024 and 23. So it really depends on the expected deployment of the technology in the country. And obviously, this comes back to also like the, how can I say? Everybody tries to do business in Spain now on the PV side, and that is the result.
Absolutely, yeah. But at the same time, we're seeing very, very robust spot prices and also forward prices across Europe at the moment, so that's also interesting. We're coming to the end, hopefully, of the global pandemic. How do you view the post-COVID-19 recovery in terms of renewables growth? We have all the recovery funds. Now we saw this week them being granted to approval for Spain and Portugal. There's a lot of EU money floating around here. How do you assess the post-COVID-19 sort of recovery and once we get at that in terms of renewables expansion in Europe?
The renewables are a clear winner of the pandemic, if I can say that. It's proven that, sustainability matters are an important factor in the global society. And we see, we see that corporates, despite the pandemic, they have still continued to work on executing their target. We saw an ever-increasing appetite for renewable energy. We see, as you mentioned already, we see at the moment this market prices rising in every forecast, at least as long as it goes as the market visibility or the electricity price visibility goes in the respective countries. So that's what we see. On the other side, what we also, what everybody now has understood, that costs, production costs, module costs, transport costs, they are also on the rise at the moment. So this is something which, and also availability of components, could be an issue for the next 1 to 2 years, which could slow down the deployment a bit. But on the other hand, in the long run, I don't see this as an issue. So this will be levelized again. And yeah, I think that's the summary. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think there, as you said, some supply issues with some components in the process there of expanding renewables or building out more wind turbines and solar panels. But you also mentioned, interestingly, in Germany, the permitting problems. Is this something that's causing also a real, or is it a big obstacle in the progression of renewables growth and PPA deals in particular in some countries?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, regulatory topics or long processes, that's always at least what developers complain about. Because I mean, we see the appetite on the offtake side, and we have the ability to build out and to develop and to build out projects. So really want to push things forward. And so this is definitely something which we also address regularly to the respective authorities or associations to really make sure that this is seen, that this is reflected, and this is discussed on the various levels. Because we believe that if we become quicker, if we can build out our pipelines, then we can contribute to the energy transition even better.
The $100 million question is, how do you speed up that process? How do you bridge those regulatory hurdles? What's the best way to do that?
Consistently being at the front of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, thank you very much for joining the Montel podcast this week. It was a pleasure having you on board.
Thank you very much, Richard.
So listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.